Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just give everybody a moment to take their seats and get settled. I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Leigh Cox. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting him yet, I can tell you that Leigh has a background in social policy, specifically in the areas of humanitarian and multicultural affairs. Leigh is currently on secondment to NAATI from the Department of Home Affairs to help implement the new language service provider endorsement model. The model is expected to play a formative role in helping to reshape the sector for the better so that individuals can gain more timely and higher quality language services. I'll hand over to Leigh. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm inclined to just say what Professor Tybee said and just take questions, but that was good. Before I do begin, I would like to take the opportunity to pay my respects to elders. We're on Ngunnawal land here, and acknowledge any elders that may be in the room. For anyone who's hasn't spent a lot of time in Canberra and you're looking at this kind of pointy thing that's not too far away from us, that's called Telstra Tower. It sits on Black Mountain. It's known as Galambri. Is a really important place. We're actually surrounded by really important meeting places. So as you're looking around in Canberra, just know you're on Ngunnawal land. I've only got about 20 minutes, so I've decided to kind of condense this presentation a little bit. There is information on the website that people can get, but hopefully we can have a little bit of a conversation and I can take some questions about the model. So a little bit about LSP endorsement or where it came from. So you may have heard this before, but it was back in the end of 2022 when Department of Home Affairs officials had meetings with a number of industry stakeholders, a number of government-owned LSPs, the union and the like, to discuss essentially what has been coined language services sustainability. Dr. Tybee did kind of speak to these issues before. It's fair to say that in a generalised sense, it is now harder to get access to services, particularly in government settings, than it has been previously. In practice, that looks like extended hospital stays for patients due to the unavailability of an interpreter and really poor access to justice outcomes in many cases as well due to either quality or availability issues, not just withstanding the issues that obviously has for the vulnerable individual, but obviously also has major productivity impediments for the very governments that are trying to basically set low-cost drivers around the services that they're offering. So after that, setting that up, it wasn't that long until the Multicultural Framework review commenced. Many of you may have engaged in some of the consultations around that process. There is an entire chapter, Chapter 6, that is dedicated to language and language services, and a series of recommendations was made by Hustalal and the rest of that independent panel. Whilst government, I suppose, hasn't moved on a range of the recommendations yet, there has been some acknowledgement internally, certainly in my time in the department, that these issues are extremely complex, notwithstanding, for starters, that we have a number of jurisdictions that go out to market for these services. So resolving issues, structural issues in one jurisdiction isn't the only thing. It's not the only main game. We need to do things in a harmonised way. And that's really, I think, what led to the decision at the Ministerial Forum on Multicultural Affairs amongst multicultural affairs ministers to look at what it could do within its existing remit to try and drive a level of service improvement across the board. And so I'll speak a little bit about those things. 2025 is obviously where we are, and I'll cover that shortly as well. I suppose from the outset, the marching orders, if you like, really were we needed better equitable minimum standards. That is things like NAATI certification, but not necessarily limited to those issues. It's publicly documented that there's been a number of cyber security incidents where, due to the absence of strong systems in place in some providers, we've seen children's details ended up on the dark web, things like that as well. Making sure where there's complaints around providers perhaps not paying superannuation when they need to, upholding laws and those types of things. And so to one extent, NAATI has been asked, well, what can we do about effectively building a framework that would set a minimal set of standards equitably across the board? At a principles level, I'd probably describe this as we have a certification system for practitioners in this country. We obviously have major government panels. I think the government spend in aggregate is something like, $300 million a year. Some of the LSPs we're talking about have, annual kind of operating spends of over 100 million. So the question is, to what extent should we have a system of either certification or endorsement for the organisation that's also playing a really critical part in the delivery of those services? So what have we learned throughout 2024? So NAATI, I suppose, commenced this particular piece of work by going out to the sector, to the market, to say, okay, governments have directed NAATI to establish a model. What do you think that should really look like? And through a process and a survey, we had really high uptake. And NAATI used that as a mechanism to develop a bit of an evidence base around the types of things that should potentially sit in a framework, which informed, I suppose, the paper that NAATI went back out with in August. I'll get to it at the end of this session, but not all of the things that came through in that feedback was directly related to what an LSP should do. A lot of the feedback came through as we need better PD, or we need new scholarships or more scholarship programs. And so those things, NAATI has very kindly looking at doing some things, and I'll talk about those at the end of the session. So we met with a lot of people once we developed a draft in August of what those measures could look like. We went out to state and territory governments, met with the providers themselves, certainly the major ones, and started having public consultations to test the feedback before we went and had kind of an in-principle endorsement from ministers on what some of those requirements are. The reason we continued the engagement beyond September is, of course, it's easy to kind of come up with principle statements like we need a code of conduct. It's another question to say, well, what actually should be in a code of conduct realistically? And I suppose the approach I've certainly taken and NAATI has taken more broadly is we want to build a level of consensus with providers who, as was described earlier, are often quite keen on doing the right thing, but it's almost through a scarcity mindset that there is this kind of feeling to compete with one another that's driving that. So there's actually a lot of goodwill in the sector, and we leverage that. So that, I suppose, took us into October, where we set up 2 consultation mechanisms. We had a smaller, tighter working group, so we could have a lot of back and forth with individuals and certain industry representatives. But we also set up a consultation group, so we weren't necessarily excluding anybody. We provided an avenue for people to come along, make comments, raise concerns, and that was a good opportunity to kind of test some of the feedback. Where we are now, just generally, is that we have developed a set of guidelines. Those guidelines have been quite well developed, and I thank Sarah Lattimore, who's in the crowd, who's done a lot of that work with me. And this information is now back with the very ministers who directed NAATI, so we're in a position to, I suppose, hopefully roll something out from January. A little bit on the requirements for anyone who's kind of come along to some of the sessions. There are 6 of them, and these are the requirements. I'll speak a little bit to some more than others. It's not, perhaps not unsurprising that there's a recommendation to use NAATI certified practitioners if and where they exist, and to prioritise them based on their level, their certification level. We have said, and you will see this in the guidelines, that we have said where possible and appropriate, something along those lines. That is not to set a carve-out, but it is to recognise the businesses in some instances will need flexibility, and I'll speak to that shortly about why that is and what we need to do to safeguard that. Importantly, I think we are setting up a code of conduct that actually a lot of LSPs provided feedback for, and there was calls for support for. That is intended to be complementary to the ethics codes that exist within AUSIT and ASLETA. If you think of those as practitioner-based ethics, this is really as an organisation. So you will expect to see things in there like adherence with existing legislative standards. That might be self-explanatory to some extent, but we know we've got issues in Australia broadly currently around working with children checks in vulnerable settings, so it's really important to enshrine some of those things. Critically, we're also saying that LSPs should not do anything that would necessarily force a practitioner to breach the code of ethics. And we're also saying that practitioners should uphold the guidelines, the services guidelines in the jurisdictions with which they currently operate. The thing I suppose I also like is we've also got another requirement in there to ask LSPs who are endorsed to advocate where a government agency is creating requirements through their procurement that effectively force the LSP to not meet the very guidelines with which that jurisdiction is set. That feedback can go direct to the agency or it can come to NAATI. That's quite useful in terms of the role NAATI can play in terms of kind of upwards feedback to try and resolve some of these issues and build a clearer evidence base about what's actually going on in some of these agencies more generally. We heard some feedback earlier in the previous presentation about, I suppose, to me maybe a little bit surprising, not all LSPs have service quality assurance mechanisms and complaints mechanisms. We received great feedback, I think it might have been from AUSIT primarily, around there needing to be processes for the inducting of new practitioners and the like. Probably the most critical one of this in some respects is the service delivery and reporting requirement, because it's the one mechanism by which NAATI has to actively monitor what's going on within the sector. So that's probably going to take longer to roll out than January. We're going to need to do quite a bit of systems work. We're doing, a bit of an internal assessment around our privacy protocols and cybersecurity standards and talking to agencies about making sure NAATI has the level of authorisation to obtain the very data they may have the control over. But it would theoretically include things like providing, CPN number. Was a NAATI certified practitioner not used? You just tell us why. So we can build a clearer picture. The thing I think that's most exciting in some respects for the sector is we're looking at what we can publish in a way that's de-identified. So obviously that would include the CPN for privacy reasons, but it would enable us, probably for the first time that I'm aware of from a language services perspective, to actually build like a national map and say, oh, look, we can see that, in Mordialloc, where my family's from, a huge proportion of Arabic speakers go and access particular health services, and we could do some comparative standings using ABS data as an overlay. So it should not only have a benefit to the governments who are kind of spending money on, at least on scholarship programs, to improve the investments they're making at a very local level, but it actually could be used by businesses who completely genuinely want to try and meet access and equity standards. Sure, there's a commercial aspect to that, but there could actually be a really great resource for all of us if we can design that well. So we're doing a lot of work on that as well. I did briefly mention that NAATI certification, if and where appropriate, that is not, I suppose, just being completely open. I suppose it's fair to say that guidelines have almost been used a little bit as a carve-out where that has been said previously, because we know that it is impossible in some settings to get access to a certified interpreter, for example. It's not to rule that out, but it is to say that maybe the highest credentialed interpreter, if he is a male, is perhaps not the most appropriate for a young woman who's got an appointment, in a sexual and reproductive health setting. We need to provide a level of flexibility and trust the very businesses that are going through this in good faith. What I suppose we will look to do over time, and do this with endorsed LSPs, is to develop a benchmark. Like, what would be appropriate if we're trying to measure the use of certified? Is that 80% of the time, 90% of the time? So we can look and we can hopefully assess some macro trends through the data. Who's doing what? But it's not intended to be punitive. That's also the other point I would make, is NAATI's role. NAATI is not a regulatory authority. So in doing this body of work, it needs to be non-punitive as much as it can, and trust and operate in good faith with providers who want to do the right thing. And NAATI is, I suppose, very keen on playing a partnership role as part of this, as it rolls out. A little bit of an elephant in the room, I suspect, based on presentations earlier in the conference. Pay and remuneration aren't a part of the model. NAATI isn't in a position to resolve issues in the model. That said, those issues are fundamental, cannot be denied for all the reasons that have already been shared. And NAATI has provided advice back to governments in earnest on the feedback it has received through the process. Feedback's been overwhelmingly positive, but people have raised those issues, and so they should. So the discussions that have kind of gone on throughout this conference about those things, they are not an impediment to progression of this model. And I suppose I would encourage, where we've got people kind of talking about processes and models to establish those things that they consult in earnest and do it in a way that everyone can get around, because there are aspects of the union's code that have some practical impediments to success, I think, and those views are kind of pretty widely held. So hopefully we can hear a little bit more about that as we move forward. From January, obviously, so we're not far away from that now, actually, so it has been a fair bit of work that's gone on in the team. We anticipated a kind of a two-pronged process to how the application process will actually work. So initially, really from 1 January, but realistically from the 5th, because many people will be enjoying leave and Sarah and I might still be on leave, we'll see. We'll look at assessing applicants for their eligibility. What do we mean by that? Well, do they have bank accounts in Australia? Are they registered for an ABN? There will need to be some level of due diligence checks as part of that process as well. That will all be set out in the guidelines. Once NAATI has determined the provider is eligible, that they are in fact an LSP, for example, delivering T&I services, we can go through a process of assessing them for endorsement. Thanks, Dave. Practically speaking, we want to minimise the degree to which a provider has to go through a really rigorous process, given that there is some regulatory aspect. We're trying to bring the sector along this journey with us as much as possible, while still having some really clear meat to the bone. So, a lot of it is forward-looking. Anyone who's endorsed needs to subscribe to a code of conduct, for example. That is not a retrospective code. It would be an expectation upon the provider at the point at which it was endorsed, those types of things. We will then obviously proceed with endorsement. We're kind of looking at the end of February to batch endorsements, so there's some equity. So you don't necessarily have one LSP going out before another who might also be going through the process at the same time, but we will work through that. The last thing I will say, because we are getting quite close to time on this, it's going to be really critical as this rolls out that we bring it in iteratively, panel by panel, where there's interest from government to do that. And we will need to evaluate it in earnest, and we will need to do that in partnership with the sector as a whole to make sure we aren't actually creating any perverse outcomes and actually undermining the very things we're trying to achieve. There's a lot of acknowledgement of that. And the other thing I would say as part of this is this model is predicated to some extent on the government still adopting it as a prerequisite requirement within their procurement. So we can build, NAATI can build a market offering, the individual or the organisation needs to come forward and go through that process. Why would they do that? Because the very organisation who might be committing hundreds of millions of dollars through a project is asking for it. So we are using the existing system to some degree as a behavioural impetus for change. And I think it can be an exciting thing if we do it right and we approach people in honesty and we make tweaks if and where we need to do that throughout this process. That is my time. I will just say, before I finished, I mentioned at the beginning, the initial survey brought up a range of other things, better PD, scholarships, better settlement planning, where communities are moving into areas and there aren't enough interpreters. NAATI, the board, and the organisation have committed, at least in the first few years, these things obviously are subject to review, but have committed to kind of putting into its own pocket to resolve some of those things, which is really terrific to see. And to the previous presentation's point on almost like the philosophical question of NAATI is a certifying authority and it does tests, it runs tests. But to what extent, as a government organisation with a level of public interest, should an organisation like that be getting involved in broader language service access and equity issues? Should it be filling that void? So we heard a lot of feedback NAATI received towards the end of the consultation process went to the issue that often multicultural affairs agencies get it. They understand. They know what bad quality looks like. They know why that matters. As you get further out, it can be the case, I'll just again be completely frank with you, a lot of people look like me, may only speak English when they procure services. Definitely. I mean, I was on a call the other day and someone, was talking about, their secretary's really into AI, That's a reasonable proposition to have if you've never thought deeply about what the services do and what the risks are. So there's a role, and the feedback we receive is this role of who's providing information to those agencies about why those guidelines matter. You know, these issues, in some respects, preaching to the choir because, you know, we're talking about the people, but there's a lot of businesses purchasing these services. So we've had conversations already about, well, is it appropriate? There's a bilingual summit that really just focuses on the government purchases. And we could bring them together to explain why stuff matters, you know, to talk about those issues about access to justice so they can kind of go, oh, holy moly, like this is serious. And hopefully by doing some of these things and doing it in tandem with some of the other initiatives at place, we can actually use this as a mechanism for quite a lot of quality improvement. I'll leave it there though. Thank you.
Thank you, Leigh, for taking us through the process and where we're up to and what we look forward to seeing going forward. So we do have a few minutes for some questions from the audience. I have a huge responsibility in terms of getting us out to lunch on time, so I will be strict. So I do ask that you please give some consideration to your questions, ensuring that they're succinct and to the point. So having said that, we do have some hands up, so if we can just take Sandra.
And you can see me afterwards, so I'll be at lunch, so if anyone wants to talk, just come over to me. Thanks. Oh, Sam.
Thanks, Leigh, for a great presentation.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing, you know, what comes out. But one point that I thought I'd like to highlight is when the point that you made about the most appropriate and then available, right? And a lot of LSPs use that to justify going for the lowest qualified. So I think we need to, you know, often, and this needs to be, and if you have this conference to people in procurement, that would be great, that often if there isn't, let's say, a Spanish interpreter available, it's because they want them for tomorrow or for today. You know, the planning hasn't happened, so they haven't planned ahead. Obviously, there are emergency situations. Or because the LSP wants the first one who replies to the call. Now, that's not necessarily the best qualified. So there needs to be some reform there where you have to give the best qualified interpreters time to reply. You have to give them, you know, the normal time. But also, if there isn't someone in person, then you go to the next best, which is audiovisual interpreting, remote. So it's better to have someone who is highly qualified remote than someone who's there who's not qualified.
Yes.
So, you know, there's a lot around that I think needs to be clarified so that it's not used as an excuse to go for the unqualified, uncertified, in languages where there are qualified interpreters.
Yeah, you know, really valuable comment. And I mean, the only thing I'd say in response to that, I suppose, is that will be the benefit to some extent of the reporting requirements. Because what we should be able to see, theoretically, macro trends, is if you have one provider providing services and you can see like a prioritisation in their level. And then if you see another provider that's saying, yes, we use the highest level and they're all RPI, we should actually be able to build a bit more of an acute understanding of that. It's also, I didn't explain this, you don't just get endorsements. So there is requirements to meet with NAATI at least once a year to discuss some of these issues. Complaints can also be lodged. I mean, we're still trying to work out, well, what's an appropriate complaint look like? There are issues that may relate specifically to endorsement, but it may be an industrial matter that NAATI, unfortunately, it has no role in. But I think over time, if we can obtain a better quality level of data and hopefully approach those businesses in earnest, we can make some shifts. And NAATI is putting money in. So, you know, who's to say that, okay, sure, maybe we can hopefully try and upskill some of those providers as well.
Thanks, Leigh. Just hand over for another question.
Thank you so much. Hi, Leigh. My name is Si Xian. I'm a Mandarin interpreter from Brisbane. I've worked for TIS since mid-2008. So when you were away, actually, I spoke to both teams you worked for, both TIS and NAATI, in the shelter outside. They said you are the kind person, probably that's why TIS allowed it when you made the shift from TIS to NAATI, I guess. So I have two questions. There is a model in New South Wales now that Health New South Wales and the Department of Community or Multicultural Affairs or Department of Justice are booking their interpreters directly without LSP. Would that work in Queensland or Victoria?
Yeah, okay, look, great question. So eligibility, so a provider, I suppose this has been in discussions with governments, endorsement is intended to apply as a prerequisite on panels. If that provider is looking to bid for work outside of, say, an internal service offering for its business or the bureaucracy that where there is no panel or no competitive process, that provider would need to be endorsed, theoretically. And that's kind of been it's meant to be equitable. If you're government owned, you should be endorsed. If you're private, you should be endorsed. If you're going through a competitive process to deliver these services. We have actually been approached, though, by a lot of providers who might be delivering in-house services who want to obtain. We'll come up with a logo, like a shiny logo showing, and we'll do some promotional work around that for businesses in an equitable way to show that they've met that. And I think because of that, we've actually been kind of overwhelmed by organisations who actually want to show that they are doing the right thing or very keen to.
Well, thanks for making that information available to us. Good to know. The second question is, with the AI language model rapidly developing, while globalization is also going ahead, more and more people are moving in and outside the border of Australia. In maybe, say, 5 years' time, where do you think where we stand?
Yeah, look, I am not the most qualified to make that, to respond to that fully. I will say, though, that the Code of Conduct includes an ethical framework for the use of AI, leveraging the existing Australian government ethical framework. So we're trying to put a level of scope around what is an appropriate utilisation of AI at this particular point. There's a broader question there I completely appreciate and I acknowledge that needs to be dealt with. I can't give you the answers. I'm not the expert there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. The boss has said we are at time. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to Leigh. His contact details are in the app. Otherwise, grab him on one of the breaks. Thank you.